Hello, everyone. I see that the numbers of participants are rising, but sort of leveling out. And in the interests of time, since we're at about 9:02, 9:03, I think we'll just get started. So, Morena koto, talofa lava, annyeonghaseyo, dajahao, minasan ohayo gozaimasu. Salamat pagi, and whatever appropriate languages that I should have used here that I haven't. A very warm welcome to you. And I'm really delighted to be able to do this introduction. As you may have heard, Seuta'afili Dr Patrick Thomsen is somebody that I have wanted to meet for quite a while. Really delighted to have him here in our scholarly community in New Zealand. He arrived back in Auckland in 2019. He is originally from Auckland, has a BA from the University of Auckland, but then went on to do an MA at Seoul National University, and then his PhD at the University of Washington. And now at the University of Auckland, he's a lecturer in global studies and in Pacific studies, but also teaches into Asian studies, gender studies, and the Art Scholars Program. So a really remarkably diverse interdisciplinary portfolio. And Patrick is the first Samoan scholar to complete a PhD in Korean studies anywhere in the world. And his doctoral study was the first to use specific methodologies to look at the factors that impact the visibility of Korean gay men in a transnational setting. In Korea, he was also the chairperson for Pacifica Connect South Korea, which is an organization that is designed to create community and pastoral care for Pacifica people in South Korea. And he is now the principal investigator for the Manalagi Project, which is New Zealand's first health and well-being project that focuses on the well-being of Pacifica Rainbow Plus communities. And he is also the Pacific Data Co-Lead for the Human Rights Measurement Initiative, and is a prolific commentator for a lot of New Zealand news outlets, and also is a columnist with I Tangata, a weekly magazine for Maori and Pacific here in New Zealand. And as an interdisciplinary scholar, as you can tell, his work is really positioned well to explore a lot of the things that we are most interested in and fit well within our conference theme. And so without further ado, Patrick, again, welcome to you and for your keynote here this morning, Problematizing the Hyphen, How Can We See Asia from the Pacific? So over to you.
Malo papitai, Stephen. E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e ngā waka, e ngā hauewha I hei Moderator, e tangi te kiki, e tangi te kaka, e tangi hoki ahau, ti hei Moderator. Ngā mihi atu ki te atu, nāna nei ngā mea katoa, aroha mai, whakatau mai rā, o te atua tēnā koe. Ki te hunga katoa kua hui hui mai tēnei rā, tēnā koe. Te mihi ki te kai kōrero, tēnā koe, te rangatira, ngā kaumātua, me ngā whaia, me te whānau katoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. O tū lilia I luma o lo oto pa ia, ma lo oto ma malu, le awhai ngā luenga pa ia o le atua, tupu matamā lii, whalu upolu tutofi, ai mai se Samoa o poto, I le awa ma le whaaloalo, o te tula ai atu wai, ma whaamalulu atu wai, o le ata oto sā ma whai ngā, o le atu nuu pele, nuu atu le tulato o Samoa, tālofa lava. Annyeonghaseyo mika, 오늘 콘퍼런스 기존 연설을 할 거에 되어 무한한 영광으로 생각합니다. 제 이름은 패트릭 톰슨입니다. 저는 사모아 출신이며 대한민국에서 10년 가까이 살았습니다. 저는 어느 식민지 폐를 벗어난 상황이 아시아 그리고 태평양 지역이 어떻게 더 의미 있게 연구되어 오는지 살펴보고자 합니다. 제가 한국에 머무는 동안에는 K-팝과 한류붐이 일어나기 전이었습니다. 그때 저는 한국 문화 그리고 한국이라는 것을 알게 되었습니다. 그리고 그때의 경험이 어느 제 연서로 있게 해주었습니다. 오늘 저는 이 자리를 빌어 저희 한국인 친구들에게 무한한 영광과 감사의 인사를 드리고 싶습니다. Almost a Pacific greetings to you all, and a big fat mahalo and talofa from Auckland. I'm addressing you today from my bidge office and still have not been able to make it to the hairdresser. So please forgive my less than optimum hairstylings for you this morning. It's a beautiful day up here in Tamaki Makaurau, and I hope the sun is also shining where you are. I know I've said already to many people that I'm getting tired of people saying we're tired of Zoom, but here I am on a Friday, late November, asking you to tune into my Zoom. For your troubles, I'll do my best to keep this as lively and picture-filled as possible. My gratitude again for your attention. My first slide here gives you a bit more context as to what I'm doing here in the first place. My story is long and checkered, which we'll cover off in today's presentation, but I wanted to share this with you from the outset so you can see what experiences have brought me into your space today. Before continuing, I would also like to send out a special thank you to all the conference organizers, especially Penny, Stephen, and Robin, and your technical team. Colin, I can see. It's never easy getting the Zoom bits to work. I've been there myself, so I really appreciate and acknowledge all of you. To all the sponsors and supporters, I also thank you deeply for this honor and invitation to be able to address you all today. I decided to start my talanoa today in 3 languages of the Pacific Asia region that I'm familiar with, as a way to not only welcome you all appropriately, but also to signal my intention. In this talanoa, I want to offer up points of discussion to advance the possibilities of a Pacific and Asian futurity that can be imagined through a decolonial praxis, as we explore the generative potential associated with passing apart ruptures and historical cleavages. We are tied together in ways beyond legacies of imperialism, and we do not need refracted images of each other distilled through our colonial histories as the only way to know each other. As I speak today, I speak as a queer Samoan scholar raised here on this whenua, on the confiscated and seized lands of Maori whanaunga. I speak from a place of trouble, but not one of pessimism. Rather, I speak from a place of optimism, where we are focused on future possibilities. Titled Problematising the Hyphen, this talk is precisely that, in which we reimagine the relationship between Asia and the Pacific and understand the limitations of the imagination in our current context. This is an opportunity for all of us involved here in the Pacific who are producing scholarship designed to illuminate understandings of Asia as we apply our scholarly and academic trade on what the late great Ikirabas and Black woman scholar Teresia Te'ewa called the problematic edges of the Pacific region, where much of the cool stuff regarding Pacific representation and culture is being produced. Teresia always knew that there was great troubled potential in this location, both subjectively and geographically, and asks us to imagine what is possible when historical hierarchies are laid bare, critiqued, and opened up for remaking. While many of my colleagues and elders have been able to unproblematically shape discourses of representation around our region's people, our people's lived realities in the center have been narrated and described by outsiders, scholars, and artists on the edges to other outsiders. Her work was always about destabilizing and problematizing categories that can tend toward essentialization as a way to repair the damages of colonialism. Between Asia and the Pacific, the lessons and possibilities around problematizing the hyphen are profound and immediate. As a Samoan scholar, raised in this settler colony in what we know as the Pacific and Samoan diaspora, I wish to seed conversation starters and offer stories that may be of use to Asian studies scholarship in Aotearoa, New Zealand. This presentation today is as much about telling my story as it is about troubling the hyphen. I will share with you photos of my journey across this presentation to bring a visual element to the storytelling. But to begin with, I wish to locate myself appropriately, and I do have some caveats to offer. I am a Samoan transdisciplinary queer transnationalism researcher, which means my approach to understanding Asia and my scholarship is unique and Pacific biased. So my Samoan perspective infuses into all that I do in the ways that I think. I do not, however, have expertise in the areas many of you carry with you, and my talk today does not pretend to be fully exhaustive. So aroha mai, or in Samoan, we say whaamālulu watu ma whaamāngalo mai besasi se upu, meaning I apologize in advance and ask that you grant me grace for any misunderstandings that my words may generate. I acknowledge all of you and your mana and the immense knowledge that you bring with you today into this space. So for me, having spent years training in South Korea and the United States in Korean studies and Asian studies departments, I'm not yet intimately familiar with what makes Asian studies scholarship in New Zealand unique or different from anywhere else in the world. However, I do understand the importance of our location. Scanning the program for this conference, I was pleased to come across two panels that looks at what I call community building and acknowledging the potential associated with the tensions of Asian communities and their lived realities in this country, and reimagining and reshaping how we view Asia and how Asia itself can be viewed from this vantage point. Indeed, our histories, genealogies, languages, not English, cultural mixing and remixing is what makes doing any scholarship in this country unique. Much of the nuances in my work is only possible because of the unique contours of this society in which we live and I was brought up in, as Auckland is a gateway to the Pacific, carrying a settler and colonial history of its own. Most of the papers being presented here, from what I can see, seem to track well with many of the patterns of scholarship produced in other settler states, which commits this work inadvertently to either reproducing or challenging particular logics associated with Orientalism, neoliberalism, militarism, and Western critiques. But I also have other questions, such as how many of the papers here looking to Asia directly to seek how to understand shifts in different Asian societies, geopolitics, history, and reading literature in reparative and exciting ways, or do so with even just a tacit acknowledgement of the land, culture, and context from which this scholarship is being produced, the Aotearoa New Zealand context. It may be difficult for scholars who work in area studies and Asian studies in particular to see why this matters. Like fish surrounded by water, our scholarship in our country is Eurocentric, where the Euro itself becomes the body of water we thrive in, and it is only in its absence do we realize how dependent we are on it for our scholarship survival. But I have a hunch that it is time to move on from the waters of Eurocentrism. Recognizing where we are writing from is going to be a key piece in understanding how Asian studies as a field, an area of scholarship, will be able to stay relevant as New Zealand, as Aotearoa, begins to remember, begins to re-indigenize itself, and begins to reconnect itself with Asia beyond the hierarchical confines of the hyphen. There is an ocean out there. If we as scholars fail to keep up with this reality, we will, for the most part, be left behind. So this talk today is about problematizing, but it is not a talk about accusing or leaving anyone out. Though my thoughts are yet to be fully realized, I'm humbled to be here as part of the community of thinkers who are committed to change. I invite you to dialogue with these ideas yourself, present new ones, reshape these conversations and drive your own. See what potential it may offer you and your work. But for now, for the next few minutes, lend me your ears. I invite you to problematize the hyphen with me. It is my hope that by sharing these stories, we may begin to think through some of the possibilities enabled by what this conference seeks to understand. Change, disruptions, and resilience, to which I would like to add remembering and problematizing. This talk will not be terribly conference keynote-like. Rather, I will focus on a specific way of disseminating knowledge through storytelling. In sharing these stories, I offer them as a way for you to all consider how your work can also rethink hyphens and relationships in your everyday life and scholarship as well. By primarily problematizing the hyphen, for me, begins with a process of remembering. So in Samoan, we say, "Sau, sau fo'i se whaisap tala." Come, listen as I tell you a story. So the process of beginning to remember for me began in 2005. I was at the end of my political science degree, looking toward new horizons as what I thought was the end of my academic journey. I had spent much of my undergraduate years as a Pacific representative to various boards, committees, and student associations at the University of Auckland and nationally. One day, I received an email from a former colleague of mine who had been working for Kraken. I think most people are familiar with Kraken, but it's the University of Auckland student magazine. And my former colleague had found work with The Listener, which was still in its heyday and prime, prior to the age of social media. And he wanted me to comment on some new research that had recently been published, which he was going to write a piece on. Research by geneticists apparently had proven once and for all that the ancestors of Pacific peoples, our ancestors, the Lapita people, whom all Polynesians are descended from, including Maori, were confirmed to have begun their mammoth journey across the world's vastest ocean from Asia. I was a former Pacific Island Students Officer, Cultural Affairs Officer, and Education Vice President for the Auckland University Students Association and the President of the Auckland University Pacific Island Students Association. So this former colleague wanted to know whether in my capacity, I had any thoughts as to how this would impact tangata whenua here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and what this incredible new research meant for me as a Samoan living in New Zealand. The problematics of asking a Samoan about issues that impact Māori aside, this was 2005, where the seabed and foreshore issue had brought thousands of New Zealanders out on the streets in protest of the Labour government's modern-day land theft, where Orewa had just occurred, and the Pākehā backlash was also in full swing. The political tensions at the time were not lost on me as he asked his questions. For my former colleague, he believed that this could be big news for all the racists and anti-Māori in the country. When we sat down to chat, I could see where it was all heading. He asked me, if the ancestors of Māori and Pacific Islanders came from Asia, doesn't that mean Māori claims to this land can be questioned? I said without hesitation, absolutely not. That's not how this works, buddy. And he was my buddy. He was a friend who had sat across from me in meetings proclaiming a pro-Tino Rangatiratanga stance. But as a reporter, it was his job, you see, to ask the tough questions now. And the implication was that this research could be weaponized against Indigenous land claims in New Zealand. So he pressed further. What about Samoans? If your ancestors are from Asia, does that make you question your identity? I could feel my blood rising at this point as I replied, absolutely not. Samoa is where our people developed our language, our customs, spending millennia there, culminating in a special relationship to our islands. This changes nothing. Our ancestors, how long is a piece of string, may have originated from Asia, but we became Samoan in Samoa. Samoa means sacred center. We are the center of our own universe, and that's the end of that. I may have said other things, but the published version of my comments in the article turned out to be far less pointed. So this was a less than fortuitous way for me to have begun my process of remembering the Asia-Pacific connection. But from the outset, I knew that the hyphen itself was the problem. It was taken in uncritical ways as a default, an accepted joiner between two worlds estranged. In all honesty, the research only served to confirm a lot of the oral traditions that existed within Indigenous knowledges of the Pacific. And it could have become a critical starting point in a generative conversation around how we could see, view, or review our understanding of the way Asia and the Pacific could be joined together. Instead, this incident was a microcosm of some of the inherent problems that occur when our story and connections are theorized by those whose investments in the two regions were as observer and not one rooted in genealogical lived experience. Our ancestors were there and their blood flows through our veins. But how are we to remember each other when those who are doing the remembering for us have ancestors who weren't there? And it was my lived experience that brought me to South Korea in 2008. I was barely 23 years old at the time, and I left New Zealand to escape what was a suffocating life I was living within a fracturing family. After years of weathering challenge after challenge, I needed to find a job. I needed to find a way to make money away from my family. I needed to get away. It started with when a friend visited with a bottle of vodka and Sauvignon Blanc. She was about to leave for Korea, and by pure chance, she suggested I go with her so I could help out my family make use of my degree. And so my movement to Korea had a different criticality ascribed to it. It wasn't about adventure or trying to learn about another culture. I left because I needed to make a better life for myself. Life in New Zealand for a Samoan kid raised by a solo mom on the benefit is not always a good life. Thus, my connection to Asia was driven to Korea through necessity rather than curiosity. And when I moved to Korea, I couldn't quite understand it at the time. But there was something so familiar about the place, yet so different to anything I had ever known. The stifling summers, for example, reminded me of Samoan heat. But there was also something about the people, indifferent at times, but ferociously loyal. The land, which felt heavy with history, ripened yearly with oranges and browns of majestic autumn harvest. And then after these beautiful, majestic autumns, suddenly we would be plunged into frozen, long, harsh, icy winters that would take my breath away. And then eventually these beautiful winters would melt into the most beautiful of cherry blossom springs of renewed energies. And it was the stories that I would encounter that would change me as I lived in South Korea. The spirit of the communities is what felt so familiar. I was working in Chungcheongnam-do, or South Chungnam province in 2010, and I was teaching at two different schools in Tangjin-si at the time. This part of Korea is about a 2-hour bus ride from central Seoul. And during Chuseok, the Korean Thanksgiving holiday, the local education board had organized for us to visit an elderly person's home and learn how to make songpyeon, or rice cakes, to celebrate the season. One of the ladies at the education office had a daughter who had studied in Christchurch. So she knew that I had dabbled in singing and asked if I would sing a song for the old folk as a gift for Chuseok. She asked me to sing Pokare Kareana. I thought it was an unusual choice at the time. So I began practicing my Maori kupu in my little apartment above the chicken shop in downtown Tangjin. Between learning Korean and staying up to date with my Samoan skills through regular Skype calls to Auckland, I was living a transnational experience of what my good friend Lana Lopesi calls the realities of cosmopolitan life. Specifically, Lana refers to our lives as Samoan diaspora kids, being imagined and embodied through Moana cosmopolitan realities. Our experiences moving through multiple social, cultural, and even religious contexts across transnational locations do not make us any less or fractured, but add more to our corpus of knowledge and skills in navigating the contemporary realities of the global textures of modern life. In any case, at Chuseok, I failed terribly at making songpyeon, but I was very successful in eating lots of it. Dressed in a traditional Korean hanbok, I was sent to sing in front of the elders who had joined us for lunch on this auspicious occasion. As my fellow English teacher from South Africa played the chords on their guitar, I began my rendition of Pokare Kareana. I'm not going to sing it for y'all today. And to my surprise, the old folks' eyes lit up. They started clapping in turn, and some even sang along, but in Korean. My version of the great Kiwi Maori love song that we have all adopted as a symbol of our national identity abroad was greeted by rapturous applause. You see, Pokare Kareana was taught to Korean children at the time of the Korean War, when New Zealand soldiers were sent to Korea in support of the US-led UN alliance that fought to protect South Korea from Kim Il-sung's invasion from the north. In reflecting on this experience, I understand now that in singing the song to Korean elders, my melody, my tongue, my words reignited connections laid before me through the hyphen built on the dislocations of war. But it had lived through people-to-people interactions, through the Maori language, sung through the voice of a Samoan whose ancestors were connected to all. My simple existence proposed a different way for us to be connected through the hyphen that day. And I would continue to remember for the rest of my time in South Korea. At each juncture of my time, my remembering troubled the relationship I was meant to have with Asia. Korea was joined to New Zealand interests in terms of security, geopolitical concerns regarding North Korea, and as an economic destination for businesses, as well as the increasing number of Korean folk who have now come to call New Zealand home. But these were often extractive and one-dimensional connections. I began to ask myself, is this the way we know Asia from New Zealand, from the Pacific? As a region, we tie our economic and security interests to through this hyphen. But what about the relationships that exist beyond it, before it, and will continue after it? Are we all to be tied to this hawkish and neoliberal hyphen forever? These thoughts come to me now, but I don't offer them as just troublemaking statements. What I also offer in my Dalanoa today is the possibility for the hyphen we uncritically accept between the Pacific and Asia to be problematized in a way that brings forward diverse ways of knowing and being. Here I wish to fast forward to my own experience conducting my PhD work in the US and Korea. It may seem peculiar to many, considering the way Korean forms of masculinity and androgyny exist through K-pop artists today. But when I first arrived in Korea, to be gay was to accept a life of invisibility. One of the first statements I encountered from one of my elementary school students, I have still to this day, I'm unsure as to why she offered this statement, was that there were no gays in Korea. This was, of course, an inaccurate, if somewhat telling type of statement. As I was partying with many gay men in the sweaty and hedonistic nightclubs in Itaewon, sliding in and out of dark lounges in Jongno, frequenting saunas, joining gay social clubs on Baum, and I even met my first Korean boyfriend at a tennis club on the dusty brown and orange clay courts along Seoul's famous Han River. The vibrancy of a queer life I was living in Korea was incongruent with the ways queer life in Korea was being portrayed by outsiders. When I decided to do my PhD in the area, I encountered many discourses imported to Korea through its own connections with US empire and European hegemony. This often dictated to Koreans that their country's stance on homosexuality was backward, oppressive, and was in need of reform. I have little to say about the way in which forms of queerness in Korea are fought away in what Todd Henry calls survivalist epistemologies. Korean queer studies scholars have done incredibly important work, highlighting the way exclusions are constructed by Korean society, history, and culture. And I'm an ardent supporter of all LGBTQIA+ organizations in South Korea, agitating for change. But my annoyance bore out of what Jasbir Puar calls homo-nationalist discourses, where the question of how a state treats its homosexuals becomes the barometer of particular forms of political legitimacy. Building on this concept, Uri Han wrote about how homo-nationalist discourses deployed by foreign embassies in Korea at Seoul Pride as an example, allowed for a type of discursive practice that uncritically accepted Korea's need to catch up with the West, allowing foreigners to position themselves as morally superior and modern, whilst Korean queer life was still oppressed and limited to the shadows. The trouble with this is that it does not allow us to see the innovative, vibrant, and crafty way queer spaces are created, built, sustained, and celebrated within local forms of queerness in Korea. The possibilities of existing beyond hypervisibility can be swept away by a homo-nationalist discursive praxis. And everywhere I went, this homo-nationalist sentiment was rife within the foreigner community. As a Samoan whose relationship with our own imperial and colonial outsiders is somewhat complicated, it bothered me that this was the lens that I was meant to know queer Asia, more specifically, queer Korea through. Politically, economically, geographically, and militarily, the Pacific and Asia are tied together by this hyphen, which assumes these particular logics. But what I experienced in Korea was a type of remembering that tied me to the worlds of people whose continental lands my ancestors' ancestors had come from. My reactiveness toward the power and hegemony of Western discourses of queer political and agitative movements was connected to a type of felt knowing rooted to a relational existence and presupposes connections based on mutually sustaining and generative relationships. When I went to carry out my PhD in 2017 to 2018 in Seoul, I had nearly a decade of experience of living with Korean queer people, Korean non-queer people, in their culture and society. I had listened to many of my friends of Korean heritage speak of their own reactiveness to Western hegemony and reject a sense of inferiority that was imposed by years of Orientalist scholarship and extractive forms of research that did not work in relational ways. As a Samoan, it was the relational that my research praxis was tied to, a specific way of doing research that honors participants as co-creators of knowledge, sharing their stories with me as a researcher whose job was to validate them in their way of knowing. As a Samoan researcher in my PhD, my positionality gave me unique opportunities to negotiate communication with Korean participants. Specifically, in Samoan social customs, there exists what we call the va, or space where social interactions take place between people. Albert Wendt explains that the va is the space in between, the betweenness, not empty space, not space that separates, but space that relates, that holds separate entities together. Samoa's traditions and protocols explain the nature of a Samoan being as a relational being. There is myself and yourself. Through myself, you were given primacy in light of our collective identity. So the concept of the va deals with holistic forms of identity formation, predicated on co-belonging and relationship building. Epistemologically, va is encoded with respect, service, and hospitality. In reflecting on my own positionality as a researcher, it was impossible for me not to be foregrounded by the va. In particular, when interviewing participants, I took the active position that considered participants as relational subjects in which I, the researcher self, was also constituted, an important part of how my Samoan worldview infused my research practice in Korea. The relational aspects of the va and its role in identity formation then, I connect to a Korean worldview that also suggests that a Korean identity or articulation of the South is framed and formed relationally rather than individually. In particular, the Korean language demonstrates the symmetry where the lexicogrammatical structure of Korean is formally dependent upon social and interpersonal factors, such as symmetrical, asymmetrical relationships, kinship, gender, age, profession, vocation, trade, as well as socioeconomic status. As an example, in presenting oneself in conversation in social settings, it's common for Koreans to select terminologies in their language that refer to the self and other in accordance with the expected honorific norms of Korean society, where nearly 2/3 of pronouns for the South in Korean is self-denigrating. In Samoan language, respect for deference accorded to others is considered an important part of respecting the va. This innate understanding of relationality derived from my Samoan heritage, and it provided me with a second sense in being able to understand the difference between relationally formed identities from an individualistic perspective. For me, it was the va that I established between myself and my participants that allowed to connect my worldview, my way of understanding the world to participants, which moved me beyond the hawkish hyphen as a connector. In this way, I connected Asia and the Pacific through a Pacific way of being, not a colonial one. In doing so, I was able to also circumvent homo-nationalist discourses and dated talk of modern versus barbaric and outdated cultural takes of queerness, instead focusing on the lived realities and future possibilities that participants in my study were engaging in. And it was not just the way that I approached my PhD research practice that shifted. By centering Pacific relational ways of being that highlights the way I, the researcher self, was being constituted, I was also underscoring what was possible in the queer studies context when a racialized positionality such as mine is in Korea, deployed generatively to read forms of queerness in context beyond the West. In a queer studies context, David Ng, Judith Halberstam, and Jose Esteban Munoz define perverse modernity, body, and knowledge as those that exist outside the boundaries of sanctioned time and space, legal status, citizen subjecthood, and liberal humanism. Indeed, their critique is that there is no fixed embodied queer subjectivity, and that inner subjecthood can only be rendered visible by examining surfaces and external conditions that make certain subjectivities viable. In this research context, queer experiences in Korea are made intelligible through the medium of race. As a queer Samoan researcher, I was legible in this space, not just through my queerness, but also through my racialized positionality as researcher, which led to extremely candid conversations around race and sexuality that I highly doubt would have been possible with a white Western researcher, as whiteness often constituted the subject of the conversation. As a result, my research and relationship with Korea reshaped my understanding of the hyphen. It was reimagined in a way that problematized the violence built into the hyphens and conceptions by bringing my Samoan Pacific way of knowing, including my lived experiences as the basis on which connections were being made. The process of remembering the Pacific and Asia connected through innovative legacies of migration and cutting-edge navigation technologies predates Western history. And this created a confidence in possibilities for me to connect to the continent beyond the extractive logics that academia and the practice of research can encourage. It created a space for me and my scholarship to be able to come through and honor the ways Korean queer folk were imagining their futures and what that meant in terms of contributions to global discussions around forms of queerness that are celebratory, culturally sensitive, and not dictated to from outside Korea. Although I was an outsider myself, my remembering of these connections brought a different criticality to the work I was doing. My remembering gave me permission to disrupt and problematize this hyphen. So what does this then suppose for Asian studies scholarship in New Zealand? And what does this mean for Pacific scholars and Indigenous scholars based here in Aotearoa? So firstly, for Asian studies scholars, I believe it offers a different way to approach the question of renewal and sustainability by incorporating the knowledges and context that is made possible by including Indigenous and Pacific scholars. The work Asian studies scholars do in our country may better reflect the multicultural communities that live here. But further than that, Indigenous worldviews and approaches to research offer a way to disrupt hierarchies that are built into this neoliberal and hawkish hyphen. New Zealand is a Pacific country by geography, but a Western one by colonialism. But it is now awakening and remembering, and the Pacific, New Zealand, or Aotearoa, is the future. For Asian studies scholars of Asian heritage, studying their homes and their literature from New Zealand, I do hope you continue to do so voraciously. Your perspectives to me are the ones that truly matter the most here. The possibilities Aotearoa New Zealand makes as a location should be celebrated and is key to disrupting what I call the Orientalist textures of the hyphen and the origins of area studies approaches which are concerned with studying the other. Exploring what responses to that challenge may look like from this vantage from the vantage place of this position will not only mark out your scholarship as distinct, but one that is in service to your own communities. Because my position in academia is in a Western and Orientalist field, one of the biggest lessons from Pacific scholars and Indigenous scholars that I carry with me is that your research must always bring benefit to communities that have not only been underserved by research, but marginalized by them. Pen is mightier than the sword. We've heard that many, many times. And this innate power in producing knowledge is a responsibility we as scholars do well at forgetting sometimes, when our plays at producing scholarship become mere intellectual exercises, divorced from the political context in which it is made possible. Remembering that one of the world's most beloved and quoted texts, Decolonizing Methodologies, was written here in this country by Maori scholar Linda Tuiwai Smith, and ask yourselves what it is that I can learn from her instructions as I occupy space in the ancestral lands of her peoples. For your courage in doing so will help to disrupt and problematize the hyphen too. I invite you to bring your own diaspora, transnational and cosmopolitan realities to push beyond the confines of neoliberal and geopolitical ties. For non-Asian scholars like myself who study social phenomena in Asia, the task of reflexive decoloniality is even more central in finding new ways forward that are not bundled up in the hierarchies of geopolitics and neoliberalism. For Indigenous scholars of the Pacific, the task of remembering is one of disruption and repair. Our genealogies, what our Maori whanaunga call whakapapa, extends back centuries to the continent of Asia. Our ancestors' stories were forged in the balapala, or the soil of these lands and their surrounding islands. But our connections to the region have been disrupted violently by imperialism, colonialism, and impacted by Orientalist discourses that encourage conflict and disconnection. One of the strategies of colonizers and colonialism is to force us to forget the process in which we have been dominated. Thus, it is important for us to actively remember our pre-existing connections. The task of remembering grows more critical in our current state of the world. Throughout the Pacific, there is increasing nervousness around China's assertive rise to power. Looking to places like my precious Samoa, for example, China's rise is currently raising tensions locally as more Chinese enter Samoa's economy as entrepreneurs. The entry through the Asia-Pacific hyphen is funneled through a neoliberal logic that has overshadowed the long history of China-Samoa relations. These relations are also marked by a shared experience of colonial exclusion within Samoan history, which defied the New Zealand administration's attempts to disconnect the relations of these two peoples. Today, many Samoans carry also Chinese ngafa, yet connections such as these have been so conveniently forgotten. I don't believe that remembering itself is a future-proof act that may avoid conflict, but it does offer us a way to rethink how this Asia-Pacific hyphen is casually tied together through imperial legacies and ongoing geopolitical shifts. I have positive examples to share here. Last year, I supervised 4 graduate level projects in Pacific Studies from Chinese students who were sent to New Zealand as part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and China's desires to know more about the region they are shifting their realm of influence toward. These 4 projects, although conceived within the framework of this hyphen of geopolitical criticalities, all shifted in ways that brought richness to my students' projects and a different type of connection to the Pacific, which moved them beyond geopolitical sensitivities in examining how connections can be built between our worldviews, experiences, and problematizing and generating uncritical ties that focus on hawkish geopolitics. All my students from China spent a considerable amount of time learning and connecting with Pacific ways of knowing, thinking, and being in connection to their own lives, engaging with Pacific methodologies and problematizing their own hyphens. The result shows in their work as they've explored a different way of engaging the way our regions are tied, acknowledging the mana inherent to all communities, circumventing Balangi lenses as far as can be achieved in English, and imagining a future that enhances the mana of all. So, in summary, how can we see Asia from the Pacific? Well, we already know the hawkish, neoliberal, and Orientalist textures that exist in the way many normative representations of the joining of our regions exist. But further to that, my experience in Korean life really has taught me that there are other ways that we can know each other, which focus on the act of remembering, reconnecting, and establishing connections through non-Western and Indigenous ways of knowing. To know Asia from the Pacific, I portend, allows us here in New Zealand unique opportunities to mark out our scholarship as not only different, but mana enhancing. So this is where my story pauses and yours resumes. I want to thank you all for your attention today and leave you with the Samoan proverb, which I believe is incredibly important for all of us as scholars. Understanding our scholarship as a type of legacy we want to leave to communities that are tied together like this. In Samoan, we always say to remember that e pala ma'a a ele pala upu, meaning rocks will decay, but words shall always remain. The proverb speaks to the enduring nature of words and scholarship, of the power of writing and the power of names. Problematizing the hyphen is a vital way in which we can understand how our words, our upu, our kupu, or tano in Korean, will last while everything around us erodes and washes away. Whakatau lava for your attention today and so forth. Thank you.
Thank you, Patrick. And we are now, I think many people have already been promoted to panelists. That you should be receiving an invitation, I understand. But in any case, for people who have questions or wish to engage, you can raise your hand. That will probably be the easiest, and we will go around. Otherwise, you can put questions into the chat or Q&A, which I will be monitoring as well. So if anyone has anything. And while we're waiting for other questions, I was really interested in just where you were ending with these students who from China who were sent as part of the Belt and Road, who've done MA projects with you. And I was just wondering if you could say a little bit more about some of them and their work. That's really fascinating to me.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you, Stephen, for creating such a lovely space for me to be able to present. And specifically, my master's students were sent over as part of a special program that the university has with the University of Auckland. They are studying at the Beijing Foreign Studies University, and originally when they came over, they understood that their main sort of task was to learn a Pacific language so that they could take back to China and then be able to sort of share that language there with a lot of the developing number of diplomats that are coming from China into the Pacific. So there is very much a geopolitical motivation for them being sent across. And so what ended up happening, of course, is that they were put into the Pacific Studies program, which has a very strong focus on Indigenous and Pacific ways of knowing, and it helped to reshape their projects. And so originally, a lot of them had projects coming in here thinking about how they would be able to increase Chinese influence, how do they understand how our people are sort of responding to some of the challenges that exist within China, foreign policy specifically toward the Pacific. But what ended up happening after working with me is, of course, I said to them, it'd be really great for us to be a little bit more reflexive and see how we can look at these issues through Pacific perspectives. And so that's how we've gotten these 4 projects so far. The first one is by Tony, and Tony used Seuta'afili which is a Samoan methodology to kind of explore the way in which Samoan language is becoming sort of a subject of interest in China, which was great because it gave Tony an insight into how Samoan ways of thinking around society can be sort of applied in this geopolitical context. And then George did his project specifically. So Pango did his project looking at the experiences of Chinese international students in the example of studying in Pacific studies, which is something that is rare. It's the first time that it's happened. So that was really interesting because George drew on Seuta'afili, which again is another Samoan methodology. If you want to know more about that, I think the best person to speak to is actually Lana, who I quoted earlier, because that's something that Lana used in her PhD. And then Eileen spoke about, obviously, a contemporary issue, that online complexity of trying to study as an international student while they were based over in China. And then Melody was speaking specifically to those tensions that exist in Samoa at the moment using the Vaiusu Wharf Project, which caused a lot of drama. I don't know if you were following the Samoan election earlier this year, but that was a key touch point for a lot of the politicians during the election. So yeah, they're great projects. And I think that they sort of speak to the possibilities of what can happen when we are engaging each other in meaningful ways. Stephen, yeah.
Okay, thanks very much. And our next, actually, I think that's Lily who's in it as John. So yeah, over to you for a question.
Cool, thank you. Thank you for the presentation and sharing your personal experiences, stories, and also the photos. One of the part that really resonated a lot with me was in singing the song to the senior, even though they don't understand the language, but they appreciated the meanings behind it. I went to China with my supervisor in the end of 2019. And in the morning, we came across a singing group just in a local park, the Chinese seniors there. And somehow they just come across and say, oh, do you mind singing a song to us? So my professor actually sent the tiaroha to them. And I interpreted what's the meaning of it. And then the group appreciated it so much. And they sang another Chinese song back to us, like appreciation. So this part has become really the most fondable memory of my supervisor of all her overseas trip. So this is just something I just want to say, that cross-culture, transnational, the understanding among people, quite often the music, the language, and many interactions actually work stronger than just academic or conference or the formal format. Yeah, that's just something I want to say. Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for that wonderful comment. I appreciate it. And I think that was one thing I was trying to get across in my talanoa today, is the value of those sorts of connections being explored as sites in which connections can be built. And I think our scholarship can be, if it's more open to it as a field, I think academia as a field tends to be quite narrow in its focus of what it considers to be valid forms of knowledge. So, for me personally, that's how I got into actually academia, because I had no designs on doing anything academic related once I finished my undergraduate degree. It wasn't until I had these experiences where I was connecting with people and realized that I wanted to know more and wanted to know how I could connect, using my authentic self, who I am as a Pacific person, specifically as a Samoan in this field. And music was something that was hugely important for me. I was allowed to, I say allowed, technically I was invited, but I think I was allowed to go and sing at particular events in Korea. And that was where I managed to build a lot of strong relationships with people who had the same sort of value towards music. And it also helped me a lot with my Korean. Those Korean songs, when you're trying to learn Korean, they move so fast. So you've got to learn those words really, really quickly. So, there's multiple different ways. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, this is actually brought to another question. How many languages can you speak? I'm just curious.
Well, I can speak English quite well, I think. My Samoan is still pretty good. It was my first language. So I'm really grateful to my mum, because she always made sure that Samoan was the only language I was allowed to speak at home. And I only learned Korean when I went to Korea. So one thing that was really interesting is that I never had any sort of pre-existing interest in Korea as a location, because this was pre-K-pop, this was pre-Hallyu days. So Korea was still kind of in that transition from its Segewa days, or like the global Korea sort of policy was only just starting to kind of take fruition. And so it wasn't until I got to Korea where I actually I realized, oh my goodness, I think I actually have to learn this language if I want to live here. So, so my Korean isn't as great as it should be. And it's gotten worse since I've come back to New Zealand. But I would say I speak 2 languages really well. I speak Korean fairly well, and I speak Maori as well as you know, as a New Zealander should, but I should probably know how to speak Maori better. Yeah.
Very impressive. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, excuse me.
Questions from others? And actually, on that point, one of the things you just raised while we're waiting is the rise of Hallyu and its meaning for the Pacifica community here, because it's really striking the extent to which it seems that within New Zealand, the community where it has the greatest level of popularity is not other, you know, Korean New Zealanders or other Asian New Zealanders, but it's Pacifica New Zealanders who really seem to have taken to at least K-pop. I don't know about Hallyu more broadly, but that connection has been really strong. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on what it means for problematizing the hyphen too. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, I have a PhD student that I'm supervising at the moment who's of Tongan heritage, and she was actually the coordinator for the K-pop fan group, I think on Facebook for many, many years. And so she was the actual person who was driving a lot of the social media spread here in New Zealand. It wasn't a Pacific group, it was just the New Zealand K-pop group that she was, you know, chairing. And we've had long and interesting conversations around why we, you know, sort of speculative conversations at the moment around why our younger generation in particular are connecting with K-pop. And so, you know, for me personally, I think you know, living in Korea, it's different. I think K-pop there is so omnipresent that, you know, usually most foreigners who live in Korea aren't big fans of K-pop. So I was really surprised when I came back to New Zealand and saw just how powerful it had become as a medium to connect to Pacific young people. A lot of it means, for me anyway, I see a lot of our young people connecting to the different types of aesthetic. It also offers a type of sort of languaging that, you know, anyway, in terms of the way that their K-pop artists present themselves, which is quite legible to Pacific young people, specifically the colors and also just having non-American artists. I think one thing that's really interesting about the Pacific is that we've had this sort of global look for a very, very long time. So life for young people in the Pacific tends to be quite cosmopolitan in terms of the influences. And so K-pop has become part of, I guess, the latest one. I think back in the 90s, it was Filipino dramas, which were the big thing in the Pacific, especially among Samoan people. We would love to watch Filipino dramas, and that was what everyone was sort of following. But now it's K-pop. So I don't really have an answer for you at the moment, Stephen, because the research is kind of ongoing at the moment, and there's lots of different people in different spaces who are having these conversations now, but this is the potential, I think, right? So K-pop is another sort of connector that moves us beyond sort of the conventional way in which we see these regions connected. So I'm sorry, I don't think I actually answered your question.
That's one thing. I've got ideas that can be a separate conversation at another time. I see a question in the chat from Kumiko Jacqueline. Kumiko, would you like to ask that?
Thank you very much. It was very nice. Asian, and also just, I'm a ceramic interest, so that's why I'm just asking about because I know Samoan ceramics is very unique in the sort of different from the origins from the Lapita, from the Fiji and the Tonga, and Korea is the original place and of the ceramics. I was wondering that if you explore that area of the connections or any art and ceramics area.
Thank you for the lovely question, Kumiko. that's not an area that I have much experience with, to be honest, but it is something that I was cognizant of. Korean ceramics are so beautiful. Like I don't have an expert eye, but when I was in markets in Korea, I would look around and just see how beautiful it all was. I do know that there are people in the art space and Pacific art spaces who are looking at those connections specifically. And if I do get some more information around some of that work, I'll be happy to pass that on to you, Kumiko.
Thank you.
Thanks.
And I see that we have a hand up from Penny. So Penny, over to you.
Welcome, Patrick. It's lovely to meet you. Thank you so much for coming along. You've added a whole different voice to our conference, and we really appreciate it very deeply. I just had a question relating to your MA students and your Chinese MA students and their projects on relating to the way Samoan and so on are taught in China, received in China. But I was very interested that even though on your slide, the names were very clearly Chinese names, you gave them all their Western names, that identity is such an issue for you.
Yeah. So, you know, I was using their names, I guess, as shorthand in reference in the presentation. But a lot of, all of them have always said to me that they would prefer for me to use their English names, although I've always asked them many times if they would like me to keep using their Chinese names, but that was a request by all of them. But, you know, when I was in Korea, I had the same issue. Like I would have to refer to my students using their English names, but they chose those English names, and I would always say to them, it's okay for me to learn your Korean name. You know, like I can speak Korean okay, and I think it's important to acknowledge, you know, your lineages. But it was always that same thing. It was the view of having this instrumental purpose of using the English name versus, you know, this other issue that I was finding really important. So in those situations, I always defer to what an individual prefers me to use in that case. But I totally understand what you mean, Penny. Yeah.
That's very interesting. Thank you. Yes. With my... So I have students, Japanese students sometimes, and Korean students, and Chinese students. It's usually only the Chinese students who want to use a Western name, which I always find is quite
interesting,
quite unusual. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, and also thank you, Penny, for all the work you've done to bring me here.
No,
I know it's been really hard.
And next we have a question here in the chat or Q&A from Sita, but you're here present. So if you want to ask that, go ahead. And then at least maybe one more from Paula, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Thank you, Patrick. That was quite magnificent. I just loved your narrative, loved the ways in which you drew together so many strands and so many multiplicity of perspectives as a way of being in the world and relating to the world. So that was fantastic and a real example for a kind of scholarship, a nuanced, empathetic scholarship that is so timely and important. So thank you so much for showing how that can be done. So my question is actually asking you to think about the ways in which Pacific Studies as a teaching program in universities and Asian Studies as a teaching program in universities, the ways in which they're set out within New Zealand institutions to provide a platform of knowledge and scholarship through all levels of tertiary institutions, the constraints and opportunities that are in place at the moment, and whether you are able to kind of work across both those programs because of your experience and how you straddle both, to think through what it means to have a consolidated presence as a program of study within New Zealand institutions along both those avenues, Pacific Studies as well as Asian Studies. Because at the moment, I'm speaking from a perspective where it all looks very piecemeal for me in relation to, and not any cohesive, coherent body of knowledge that is being furthered.
Mm. Thank you, Sita. Thank you for your wonderful comment at the beginning. I really appreciate it. And also, I think I share a similar concern that you expressed around how we do bring all of these things together into a consolidated kind of teaching and research program. I think one of the reasons why I've made the move recently to global studies is because global studies has a very specific focus on trying to allow these multiple different bits and different ways of seeing the world to sit in tension with each other, but also in a generative type of tension and a productive tension with each other. And so I will just at this point say that I take your feedback on, very much in a generative light, and I think you're absolutely correct. And I hope that we can continue this conversation. It's not just for me, it's for everybody in the room who's excited by these sorts of conversations to have. So thank you so much, Sita.
Thank you.
Sorry to unmute. And then I think just really quick, Paula also had a question, and we will try to do that, and then we'll have to bring things to an end. So Paula, please, over to you.
Yes, I wasn't sure there was going to be time, because my question, Patrick, I loved your presentation ways that I cannot even begin to start telling you how much I really, really, truly enjoyed it in a deeper level. But you did tell us the whole story, but I am particularly curious about a little bit more about, talking about the center of neoliberalism and Western colonization, right? You did, like many of us, ended up doing our PhD in that center. And then if you have the time to say a little bit more of how this was formative or not formative, or a little bit more, I would really appreciate.
Thank you. Thank you for your lovely comments, Paula. Are you meaning specifically the critique of neoliberalism as the connector?
Yes. How doing your PhD there? Anyway, like you talked a lot about the tension and the connection. Just if you have some thought to share.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that was really interesting for me in my experience in Korea was that a lot of the New Zealand organized events or the expat events was always organized through MFAT, which meant that the way we knew Korea and we were talking about Korea had a very specific neoliberal texture to that discourse. It was always about, we need to develop these connections, so New Zealand businesses have these opportunities here in Korea. If you spending time in Korea, Korea's unique story and its unique sort of the many struggles it's had, right, with the hyper neoliberalism and sort of where it is now in terms of development and what impact that's had on individuals and peoples and on human rights in Korea. So, all of that to me felt like it was all wrapped up together in that conversation that I was looking at in terms of why are we looking specifically at Asia and Korea through just these one-dimensional lenses, which were so extractive, and neoliberalism was part of it. So I think one of the hardest things for me to do in the project was sort of think about the threads that needed to be left untied. And that was one of them while I was, looking down this path. But I think it's something that a lot of the younger queer scholar generation in Korea are actually examining in more detail, Paula, specifically the role of neoliberalism and, understanding how that creates and generates particular types of queer representation and queer subjectivities in Korea. So,
Patrick, as usual, as an Italian, I'm always messy in my question, but actually was more interested in your personal experience when you were doing your PhD in the States.
Personal experience. Oh, okay.
It was much more personal, rather than intellectual, because we're in the land, at the center of the
Absolutely. I mean, America was a totally different kettle of fish altogether. I had this really naive sense that I would be able to go to go to America after living in Korea for so long and be like, oh, this is going to be great. I'm going to a country where I won't have to explain myself. And, of course, that was the one place where I had to over-explain myself, even though everybody spoke English. It was so interesting for me. And also just the way America was so neoliberal to I mean, in every sense of the word. In Seattle, I mean, Amazon was there. I would walk past Amazon's headquarters every day and just in awe of just what they've been able to achieve off of the back of not taxing companies. And, you know, that sort of experience was also important for me to understand what I didn't want to do in terms of my research, if that makes sense.
Sorry, because for me, my biggest cultural shock was not to go to China, but to go to the States. So I felt honestly much more, you know, at home in China than at the beginning. Sorry, I didn't mean to go.
No, and I know we've run out of time, but that was actually my thing. When I went back to Korea to do my field research in 2017, when I left left America after I did my qualifying exams, I got off the plane, landed at Incheon International Airport, and the first thing I said to myself was like, oh, it's so nice to be home.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was an interesting experience, but thank you for the question. I really appreciate it, and thank you everybody for listening. It's been a wonderful experience.
And thank you so much. I'll just add that it's a culture shock for me when I go back, even having been born there, but never. But Patrick, we'll really look forward to carrying on this conversation in the future. Thank you for a wonderful keynote this morning, getting things off to a great start for our second day. And I'll look forward to seeing everyone else about on virtually in the ether over the next several hours. So take care all, and I'll sign off here. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.